Welcome back to the program, Tim.
Hello, thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's my great pleasure, of course. Now, Tim, as we speak, the United States is in the midst of bargaining a new trade deal with China, one that looks to be falling apart at this very minute, in fact. But far from amicable meetings of the minds and interests, this looks like more like a cage match. How does what we're seeing, and especially not seeing, going on between these two superpowers inform and or reinforce the themes of your book, Tim?
It's sometimes called the globalization paradox, and the theory goes something like this, that the United States creates a global system of so-called free trade in order to maximize profits for its own corporations. That's not really controversial, but the paradox arises when other countries start to benefit from that. So when the U.S. enjoys cheap labor in, say, China for Apple factories, that actually produces some revenue in terms of sales of Apple products or taxing the labor that goes into Chinese assembly. And so China's GDP increases, and then it becomes a threat to U.S. interests. So it's a sort of doom loop where in order to try and profit, corporations end up creating inadvertently their own kind of competition. And so every so often, and how it relates to the themes in the book, is that periodically the U.S. will seek to change the global trade and investment landscape to keep up with modern times. So after World War II, there was a system of regulated capital, and that was done internationally through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. But then as the economy began to transition towards more high technology and intellectual property, they tried to rewrite the rules through the World Trade Organization, and that had some pretty awful effects for American workers because where they had lost some jobs to Mexico, let's say, when motor companies moved their plants to Mexico, they now had additional competition from China with the accession of China to the World Trade Organization. So now that China's challenging U.S. economic dominance, the goalposts, as it were, are going to be shifted again, and the system of international trade and these, which is not really to do with trade, it's more to do with opening up economies for U.S. investment, that will now reflect U.S. interests more. So what's happening today, we've had the technology boom since, the late 90s, really. What's happening now with automation is that a lot of tech companies, no longer need physical labor. They can create products with either physical robots or with algorithms if it's software writing. So what Trump appears to be doing by raising these huge tariffs on China, which is actually hurting Apple, because when Apple tries to re-import its assembled products back into the U.S., they'll be hit with tariffs. So what Trump is trying to do, it seems, is to start basing Apple production in the U.S., where the products can be assembled by robots, so you don't even need humans anymore. Well, that will obviously drive down wages in the U.S. because workers are going to be in competition with Chinese workers. They're also going to be in competition with robots. And so it's a kind of race to the bottom, and rather than the big multilateral deals like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Trump prefers these one-on-one bilateral deals because in a big multilateral arrangement, the power of the U.S. is weakened because other countries can form a kind of alliance, whereas in one-on-one deals, because the U.S. remains the biggest economy and the biggest military power, it has the most power of the two given players. That's partly why the U.S. wants Britain to leave the European Union, so that Britain's no longer part of a union, and any future trade deal, quote-unquote, with the UK will mean that it's even easier to buy up British services and so on.
Well, it's the old divide and conquer ploy. We've seen it successfully used for however long, how many centuries. When you talk about, Tim, moving the goalposts, I mean, democracy used to be one of the goalposts, and human rights, too, when dealing with China. It was used for some period, in the ancient way back of maybe a decade ago, to try to leverage Chinese labor standards and so forth. That doesn't seem to be such a big deal anymore. It seems, Tim, that any goalposts that are getting moved seem to be on our side, or at least on the Western side of the equation, especially when it comes to democracy. The subtitle of your book is Free Trade as Weapon Against Democracy, Healthcare, and the Environment. Well, it seems our democracy that's in the crosshairs, eh?
These so-called free trade deals, which don't have much to do with trade, are actually extremely dangerous for democracy, because if democracy means having control over your own life and having some influence over government, what the actual text of these deals do, whether it's bilateral deals of the kind favored by Trump or whether it's multilateral deals favored by, say, the Democrats, they actually privatize public institutions. There's a lot of clauses in these texts to allow foreign companies to take over various services. So the European Union, for example, has signed a recent deal with Japan, and it talks about getting access to Japan's transport systems. That's just one example. So that's going to take away public ownership and public influence over key services. So that's one way in which these undermine democracy. It also undermines democracy in more complicated ways. So people experience a decline in their living standards. They have less control over their lives, and they start to, the political center starts to really fragment. So some people go off to the far right, and we see this now in Europe with the rise of so-called populist political parties, which again is a propaganda term because populists should be of the people, but these are really extremists and in many cases charlatans that are tapping into that kind of mostly white working class rage, and so that's also dangerous for democracy, because we know where that leads. That can lead to fascism. And in terms of the other potential threat, one of the many, is the clauses that are in the text that allow corporations to sue governments, these investor-state dispute settlements, which actually date back to the 1960s and are primarily based in the U.S. in courts of arbitration. And I believe Canada, for example, has been sued several times by the United States, or at least they've attempted to sue, because Canada's tried to impose some environmental regulations against U.S. and other corporations. In particularly vulnerable countries, like, say, in South America, where the governments have even less power, it's even more intimidating. So even the threat of a lawsuit can be enough to make foreign governments more compliant to the interests of U.S. corporations. So there are a million ways in which democracy can be threatened by these so-called free trade agreements.
Well, that's certainly the way it's played out here. Chapter 11 of the NAFTA agreement has seen Canada sued by corporations based in the United States, as you say, for bringing in environmental concerns and blocking water exports to bulk water exports. And Canada, in turn, has sued other countries using the same provisions of trade deals as well. I find it really interesting, Tim, when you talk about the JEFTA, though, that's the Japanese European Union free trade agreement. And what the Europeans were really worried about or interested in, especially the Germans, I expect, is trying to get into the Japanese auto trade, and then they started picking on the public transport system. It reminds of Roger Rabbit, the undermining of public transportation to further the aims of the automotive and petroleum sellers. I'm reading, Tim, your article, and I put it up at my blog site, guerrillaradioblog.blogspot.com, Resisting the New World Order: How China, India, Japan, and Russia establish alternative trade and investment blocks. And this is taken from a chapter from Privatized Planet, your latest book, and this alphabet soup of trade deals here, there, and everywhere is interesting, and is an interesting element of this chapter, at least, or this portion of the chapter. And I wonder how this really makes the Americans feel. And you say that they prefer dealing bilaterally, so they're the biggest in the bloc, of course, when they see these other nations getting together, as they are, and as you outline in this article, with agreements like the Japan-European Union trade deal, but also with the RCEP, something I'd never heard of, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. What's that, Tim?
Yeah, well, that's a kind of, I mentioned earlier, the big multilateral deals that the U.S., through mostly the Democrats, tried to fashion so that the U.S. would be able to lead that region of the world through the Trans-Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But the one you just mentioned is the kind of Asian equivalent of that, the challenge to it, and that would involve the bigger powers of Asia. And in terms of how the U.S. reacts to that, it's not just the United States, it's any nation that has enormous power believes that it has a right to rule. That's part of the psychology of power. Once you have power, you see everything as yours. And the British were the same 100 or more years ago. Today it's America's turn. So they don't see that China or Russia or any other nation has the right to direct its own course in international affairs. It has to be subordinate to the interests of the U.S. And the way that the U.S. is countering that, particularly with Russia, but also with China, it's extremely dangerous. I mean, Russia and China can defend themselves with intercontinental ballistic missiles that have nuclear warheads. So when one nation starts to try and dominate another in the interests of undermining the other nation's sovereignty in terms of trade and investment, this could lead to extremely serious escalation and possible even nuclear accident, which even a small, what's called a limited exchange of nuclear weapons would have potentially devastating effects on the whole world with a nuclear winter and so on. So the quite serious institutions like the Federation of American Scientists and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists are very worried about this, and they regularly publish reports about how geostrategic rivalries will escalate tensions to the point of possibly terminal disaster. So we should always be aware as well that these, and it's not just the U.S., I mean, part of the Russia's annexation of the Crimea was about trying to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence. So the U.S. is not alone in this, and it's quite plausible that some of these states would be willing to use force to protect, quote unquote, their interests, which means the interests of their elites, possibly at the risk of everybody else.
Well, yeah, the old joke used to be one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day, and we've seen just yesterday the North Korea is resuming its missile tests again. Obviously, unhappy with the breakdown of talks with the United States, and feeling a little miffed by if the pictures are any indication of the actual mood of the leadership there. But also, I'm reading right now on Agence France Presse at this moment breaking news that the China-U.S. bilateral deal seems to be breaking down. I know a big problem they have, and you mentioned the Ukraine earlier, and an interesting aspect of that you say that the Ukraine, the coup in Ukraine was meant to force the Russian annexation, which is a term I don't agree with, of Crimea. It was a referendum, after all, of the Crimean people, and overwhelmingly accepted. But that was actually a ploy that the Americans planned for that, and hoped that that's what would happen, so they could use it as an excuse for more military encirclement and to lay on more sanctions, which they've done both of, with Canada's assistance, I say, with great sorrow. But we're seeing, Tim, also other aspects of the news that are informed in another way by what you write. And one of them is the Belt and Road Initiative. We saw this trouble in Kashmir. Well, Kashmir is a loci of the planned route of this this huge initiative of China and its partners. Can you tell me a little bit about Kashmir and how it plays into the role of the Belt and Road Initiative, and why the Americans are worried about this whole plan?
Well, that's one of the remnants of British colonialism. I mean, when India declared independence from Britain in the 1940s, and then the country split and Pakistan formed as well, Kashmir was one of the unresolved territories. So India and Pakistan both claim sovereignty over Kashmir. So there are parts under Pakistani control and parts under Indian control, and it's a pretty intractable conflict. And it's also, again, relating to nuclear weapons. Since 1998, Pakistan has had nuclear weapons. India long before then. So it's the two countries have come close to nuclear war over this and other issues. So it would certainly be, in some ways, in the interests of the U.S. and Britain to keep the conflict going there as a way of hindering China's new Silk Road. But that would be an extremely dangerous thing to do, given the nuclear tensions between Pakistan and India.
Well, how, Tim, does the so-called Pakistan corridor of the Belt and Road Initiative play into these long-term or long-standing dispute between both Kashmir, or between Pakistan and India, and how it plays into the broader regional tensions? Could the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, that hopes to run through the so-called Pakistan corridor, which Kashmir sits right in the middle of, is this part of the reason, or could it be the reason for further exacerbation of the tensions already there?
Yeah, it's going to play into it as Pakistan seeks to have influence over the route. But it's also worth remembering that right next door to Pakistan, the U.S. is still occupying Afghanistan. When the U.S. invaded in late 2001, it began to build a permanent military base, and that means permanent. And there are continued drone attacks by the U.S., which is a way of the U.S. having a kind of footprint there without having heavy bases, and that's in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the U.S. has a presence there in terms of military occupation and also drones. The other interesting question is the ex-Soviet states like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the ones that are to the north of this. Can China get influence over those, or is the U.S. going to increase its influence there? We'll have to wait and see what happens to those countries.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating. I haven't read your book yet, Tim. That the chapter, the portion of the chapter I have read, it's fascinating to me, and it provides light on certain subjects that, from an angle that I've never read before, and I've read quite a bit. And one of those is something you mentioned, the broader Middle East and North Africa initiative. I've never heard of such a thing. Could you? And we only got a couple minutes left here, Tim. But can you explain what the broader Middle East and North Africa initiative is, and how it elucidates or illuminates rather some of the things we've seen in the last few years, especially in that region, but may not have understood that there's a larger plan behind it all?
Yeah, so the U.S. State Department, the British Ministry of Defense, they continue to say that the Middle East is the most important region in the world because that's where the oil is. And the militaries run on oil, the banks profit from massive cash revenues from oil. So the U.S. seeks to dominate the region, North Africa as well, but it wants more than that. It's not just about oil, it's about getting as much as it can from the population. So the aim is to privatize all public resources there, turn them over to private U.S. and European interests to increase tourism in Tunisia and Libya, which is going to be a big challenge now after what they've done to Libya, and to turn this into a whole integrated, privatized area via these kind of bilateral deals. And that's part of what the destruction of Libya was all about in 2011. It was designed to go in there with a wrecking ball and then to privatize Libyan water and education, and there was even a plan called it was Libya 2025, I think, or 2020. There's a similar plan in Saudi Arabia called Saudi Arabia 2030 or something like that. These are just brochures to advertise privatization so that foreign investors can come in and buy up various sources, whether it's universities or whether it's healthcare. And this generalizes across the region, so they called it the Middle East and North African Initiative, and it was basically a U.S.-led operation to privatize and integrate, kind of like turning the region into the European Union in a way.
Well, it's fascinating reading, Tim. T.J. Coles is the writer, Privatized Planet, Free Trade as a Weapon Against Democracy, Healthcare, and the Environment. You can get it online. You can go to my site to get the links to it, guerrillaradioblog.blogspot.com. Thanks a lot, Tim, for coming on again and telling us about it today.